Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Als Jesus, Christus in der Nacht, which translates to the night when Christ would be betrayed. Very short chorale, has some interesting moments harmonically, but really not too much to write home about. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So maybe the most interesting part of the chorale is the key signature. We have no sharps or flats. We start on D minor, we end on D major, so I think the overall tonality of this chorale is in the realm of one flat, so D minor, F major, but we have no key signature, which is a case of what I've been calling in my notes as key signature disagreement, which pops up from time to time in Bach. And I want to get to the bottom of why there's no key signature here, and he goes to the trouble of writing the flats. I have my theories, but I need to go back and look more specifically. That being said, I believe we start in the key of F major actually. We just happen to start on a 6th chord. That's not uncommon for Bach to do, and our first cadence is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F. So like I said, we start on a 6th chord, and then we immediately go to excuse me, E, C, G, and C, which is C major over E. It's a 5/6 chord. Then we have F major, F, C, G, and A, but this G is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. It's this F that's our chord tone, and that's a tonic triad. We then have G, B flat, F, and B flat. Again, I think we have another suspension here. This time it's a 7/6 suspension, so although it might be possible that this is a 2/7 chord, G minor 7 without the 5th, I do think this is an E diminished chord actually over G, so 7/6. And if you've seen my videos in the past, you know what chord's on the other side of this. It's a tonic triad in first inversion, A, C, F, and A, clearly one of Bach's most favorite chord progressions. And as we close in on the cadence, we have B flat, D, F, and G. That's G minor 7 over B flat. We know that Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, especially in cadential situations. And then we have some type of C major chords, C, C, F, and G. Another suspension here. That's a 4/3 suspension over the bass. We know that C major is being implied. This very brief chordal 7th as well as passing in the tenor. And then we cadence on 1, F, A, C, and F, tonic triad, root position. Fairly staple chord progression here. Then interestingly, we're actually going to move to the key of A minor. Our first cadence is in the key of A minor, but we're going to see this Picardy third here and assume that it's just going to move us towards the area of D minor because A is also the dominant of D, and this is a convention that Bach has of moving to the key of the minor dominant and then cadencing in major in sort of like a roundabout or glorified half cadential fashion. So starting things off, I do think we move right to the key of A minor pretty much straight away. We have F, C, A, and A, which is another tonic triad with a passing 7th on the bass. I do believe this is in the key of A minor, a 6 chord in root position. And then we have D, F, A, and B. I think there is an argument to be made that this is a 7 chord, but the suspension doesn't really work the same way like it has been in the previous phrase. We have A over the D here, which is a 5. That's a consonance, and if we resolve that down by step, that would be a 4, which would be, from a suspension standpoint, a dissonance. So this isn't a traditional suspension by any means. I think this is more so just a lower decoration, and Bach is continuing to harp on this A for a very long time. So every time he goes down to G sharp, it's just a slight deviation away from A, perhaps to just vary the line or to contribute to the harmony. So I don't think there's a G sharp diminished chord here. It's unlikely without some type. Oh, you know what? This is a D, not a B. Oh goodness, no. I'm going to take all of what I just said back. This A is a non-chord tone, and where you could make an argument that yes, this is a B minor 7 flat 5 chord over D, I think this is actually G sharp, B, D, and F. See, you know what? I had a very hard time learning to read growing up, and it still sticks with me. I always confuse my clefs. See, this makes so much more sense to me now. I should always just follow the process. Yes, G sharp diminished over D. This would be some type of 7/4/3 chord, fully diminished because this is an F natural, and that goes to our tonic triad A minor over C, C, E, A, and C, 1/6. There we go. That makes so much more sense. So sorry for that departure there. That I got confused between my clefs. I thought he doubled the B. It was very confusing to me. But this makes a lot more sense. Then we have B natural, D, A, and D. Again, I think this A, this time it actually is more of a traditional suspension. This would be a 7/6 suspension over the bass. This is G sharp, B, and D, which would be a 7/6 chord. G sharp diminished over B, and if you can recall the progression we saw earlier, you probably know it's going to be on the other side of this 7/6 chord. It's going to be a tonic triad in root position this time because we started with 1/6, A, E, A, and C. We then have D, F, A, and B. B minor 7 flat 5 over D. That's a 2/6/5 chord. Here we're actually seeing the 2/6/5 chord, not a 7 chord. But yes, I do think in this case it's very clear that we have a 2/6/5 chord in comparison to here where we have two notes or some type of subdivision of the harmonic rhythm here, and we have to make a choice about which one is the chord tone based on context. But 2/6/5 in a very similar cadential fashion to how we had our first phrase end. E, E, G sharp, and B. It's a 5 chord, E major, passing 7th in the tenor again, and then we have A major, A, C sharp, E, and A. Cadence is on A major because that A major is going to later be contextualized as the dominant in the key of D minor, so he elides one key with into another key. Next phrase ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor, like we would expect, and we get another A major chord, A, C sharp, and E. So for all intents and purposes, we get some vocal rotation where the voices are being swapped. Sorry, I need to be careful with my language there. The voices are not being swapped. The notes that each voice is singing, is changing, so they're rotating with one another. That's what I mean by vocal rotation. So it's another one chord, major, but it's also in the key of D minor, our 5 chord. We then have D, A, D, and F. That's our tonic triad, D minor in root position. This D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have D, A, D, and F again. That's another D minor chord. No need to mark it. And here's where it gets interesting, because without the key signature, we have to take into consideration the fact that there might be some melodic minor going on here with B and C sharp. Even though the C sharp is happening at the same time as this B flat here, we have B naturals against B flats in close proximity to one another. It's something that we have to take into consideration. So we have B natural, G, D, and G, but we also have this E here. I do think this is some type of 4/6 chord, G major, and it's relatively common for Bach to use the major subdominant because he uses melodic minor so frequently. And I think that might be the reason why we have no key signature here, because it may not be a reflection of the key, but rather just the overall proportion of accidentals. Does B natural get used more, or does B flat get used more? It may not even be a reflection of the key at all, which kind of changes the way that we've adopted the meaning of what a key signature is supposed to be. But regardless, I think this E is a non-chord tone for this chord, but it does turn into a chord tone on the next beat. This B natural is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have E, B flat, C sharp, and G. This is C sharp fully diminished over E, which would be 7/6/5. And 4 going to 7, that's a good sign. Interestingly, though, on the next beat, if we look, we get C sharp, A, E, and A, which would be another case, historically speaking, of Bach taking a dominant functioning chord and then going to another dominant functioning chord. However, I don't think this is necessarily the case. I think very briefly with these two passing Ds here, we have D passing in the bass and D passing in the alto. It changes the quality of the chord. We have D, B flat, D, and G, which is G minor over D, which would be a passing 4/6/4 chord. Locally to the 7 chord, this would be some transitive harmony, right? Because we would expect 4 to go to 7 like we see it here. But the same voice leading could take us back to 4. It would just be going in reverse. And it should be the same level of smoothness. It would just be approaching the tonic, which is the end goal of a tonal piece of music, right? It would be approaching the tonic from a different direction, and that's exactly what I think this 4-6-4 chord is accomplishing. Instead of going from 7 to 5, he goes from 7 to 4 and then 4 to 5, and that little buffer creates a bit of a gap between two dominant functioning chords, and I think that that's pretty neat. So this B right here, this B natural is a non-chord tone, this D is a non-chord tone. We then get C sharp, A, E, and A. Again, that's another 5-6 chord we don't need to reanalyze. And then we have A and C sharp here, which are both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And then we cadence on D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad and root position. Closing in on our last phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor, so no modulations from this point forward. Even though it kind of sounds like this section here sounds, it sounds almost like we're in the key of F major, very similar to how we start the chorale, but I ultimately think that we stay in the key of D minor. It just is too brief and doesn't really feel fully justified based on immediately turning back to D minor afterwards. So we start off with the D minor chord, D, F, A, and D. No need to reanalyze. Passing tone in the alto. We then have C, G, C, and E. This would be a subtonic 7th, C major, or I've seen some people call it 5 of 3. That's what I grew up calling it. That was just the textbook that I used growing up. That's what they referred to 7 chords as, and I think it's kind of redundant because 7 wants to go to 3 regardless because of the cycle of falling fifths, but the textbook called it 5 of 3. So if you call it 5 of 3, that's totally fine. If you call it 7 or flat 7, that's fine too. Exactly same thing. We also have a passing 7th in the bass before we go to A, C, G, A, C, and F. That's F major over A, which is 3-6, so 7 wants to go to 3, 5 of 3 obviously wants to go to 3. This F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then immediately start hinting back at D minor again. We have E, B flat, C sharp, and G. We actually saw this chord earlier. This is C sharp fully diminished over E, which would be 7-6-5, so more transitive harmony here. One side of the 3 chord has a subtonic 7th, the other side of the 3 chord has the diminished 7th, so it kind of shows both sides of what the 7 can do. It can tonicize 3, and it can tonicize 1, depending on whether or not you raise the tonic of the chord. So that's pretty cool. This G is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have F, A, D, and F. That is our tonic triad in first inversion, D minor over F, with a passing tone in the bass. We then have A, D, and E. This D is a 4-3. Oh, there's like a crumb under my score here that made marking that difficult. Sorry. A, D, and E. It looks like a 1-6-4 chord, but this D is actually a 4-3 suspension over the bass, so we know that 5 is being implied here. This E is a chord tone. Then we get our resolution on the next beat. A and C sharp are both chord tones, so we don't need to reanalyze anything. This G is a passing 7th, and then we cadence on not A major, D, F sharp, A, and D, as Bach often does with his minor chorales where he cadences on the major tonic. And that's going to be today's analysis. Honestly, not too difficult. Apologies for stumbling through this right here. It just goes to show that my reading is still something that needs to improve, even after having, been reading for, 20 years now. It's crazy. Ever since I was like a little boy, I've been reading, and it was always very difficult for me, and switching clefs was the worst. I was never a good piano student, and reading made me so frustrated as a kid that I couldn't play piano, and I stuck with guitar, and one clef was already hard enough. So it has definitely transcended my childhood into my adult years, and I'd like to think that analysis and getting closer to music through score study has made me a better reader, but I always have to flip my brain around to translate the clefs and really focus to keep the notes from blending together. It looks like the page, if I read for too long, the page starts to scrunch and the lines start to blend together for me. It's hard to explain. I explained it to an optometrist, but no, I have good vision, so it's definitely a confusing situation. But really not too much to write home about this chorale. I think this second phrase is probably the most interesting because of this, I think this passing 4-6-4 chord here, there's more than meets the eye in terms of what it's actually achieving. It's pretty cool that there's a buffer in between two dominant functioning chords. I think that that's pretty interesting. And of course the hallmark of, or one of the hallmarks of this chorale being the fact that there's no key signature despite being in the key, or at least what we might in modern times consider the key of 1 flat. We know that the key signature often corresponds with the overall tonality of the music, but with Bach, it's not always the case. And this isn't just one fringe case. There are several, maybe even a dozen cases where Bach uses a key signature that isn't a reflection of the key of the music. So that's something to explore and definitely take into consideration later. But again, apologies for bumbling through this section right here. It's embarrassing, but I do want to leave it in there because it's part of the process, and it didn't the analytical process, that is, and it didn't take too much out of the time. So I'm glad I was able to work through that because it made a lot more sense functionally speaking, and it would have been a definite anomaly if we had a 2-6-5 chord going to 1. I'd have to explain how that would make sense. But regardless, if you're interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you'd like to be notified of my daily upload. I upload once a day. And you could also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that my video is going to be seen by more people, and that's a good thing. I want more people to watch the videos so that we could have more discussion about analysis. I'd love for people to throw their ideas and their observations and questions into the comments section. It makes my day. But other than that, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.